November 24th in Geneva regarding the nuclear program of Iran. Dr. Tirta Parsi was following the talks in Geneva and will brief us on the Iran nuclear deal, how we got here, and what it means. It's a great honor to have you with us today, and now I'll give floor to Ingrid Rutsiskova, who will introduce today's speaker. Please.
Dear Mrs. Ban, dear ladies, gentlemen, it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Tirta Parsi to the Women's International Forum event and to New York as well. Mr. Tirta Parsi is the president of the National Iranian-American Council, the largest Iranian-American grassroots organization in the United States. He is also an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Gromeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Mr. Parsi has followed Middle East politics through work in the field and extensive experience on Capitol Hill at the United Nations. He is frequently consulted by Western and Asian governments on foreign policy matters. He has also worked for the Swedish Permanent Mission to the United Nations, where he served in the Security Council, handling the affairs of Afghanistan, Iraq, Tajikistan, and Western Sahara, and in the General Assembly Third Committee addressing human rights in Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Iraq. Dr. Parsi studied for his doctoral thesis on Israeli-Iranian relations under Professor Francis Fukuyama at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. In addition to his PhD, he holds a master's degree in international relations from Uppsala University and a master's degree in economics from the Stockholm School of Economics. He has served as an adjunct professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University, an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute, and as policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Parsi's articles on Middle East affairs have been published in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, and others. Tirta Parsi is a frequent guest, for example, on CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Tirta Parsi.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending today. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you so much for the International Women's Forum for inviting me to talk about this highly timely and I would say very, very important issue as well. We are suddenly in a situation in which actually diplomacy is making some significant headway after a very long period of hardly impressive track record, either for diplomacy or for any other policy option that had been pursued in handling the challenge of the Iranian nuclear program. What I want to talk about here today is first a brief analysis of why it is so that suddenly we had this breakthrough. What are the various factors that have helped ensure that this time around there actually was a success? And also discuss the challenges that remain, because at the end of the day, this is no more than just an interim agreement at this point. It has to reach a full conclusion, which it has not yet. And thirdly, also to look at it from a little bit of a bigger picture, because at the end of the day, this is not just about nuclear issue. This is going to have an impact on the region as a whole. It's going to have a major impact on the very direction of Iran as well going forward. Now, we'll address that as well. If we take a look at the situation in which we more or less have a breakthrough that comes very unexpectedly. Just to put it in context, in early 2012, Secretary of Defense of the United States puts the risk of a military confrontation between the United States and Iran at 50-50. That's, dangerously high, mindful of the tremendous impact and the repercussions of a military confrontation. And this was not the words of someone who didn't study this issue very closely. These were the words of the Secretary of Defense of the United States. Yet, a year and a half later, we have a breakthrough that I know folks, at least on the US side, did not at all expect just months ahead of this. And why is this? Well, there's a couple of factors beyond others. There's obviously a very complex situation, but I would list a few factors that have been absolutely decisive in order to be able to bring this around. The first and one of the most important ones is the fact that the Iranians went to the polls in June 2013, contrary to expectations amongst many, including myself, that doubted to the very last minute that there would be a high participation in these elections. And they elected the most moderate person that was available to them on the slate, who won a landslide victory by defeating all 6 remaining conservative candidates and becoming president only after the first round of voting. And with him came a group of people who had been at the helms of Iran's foreign policy for quite some time, but essentially had been marginalized for the last 8 years during the Ahmadinejad years. And this was a group of people who had worked tirelessly before to try to find some sort of a solution to this issue, who had made numerous proposals to the West throughout the period of 2001 to 2005. Unfortunately, not successful. And just to give an indication of the difference between the mindset and approach of this crowd compared to the people who were at the helms of Iran's foreign policy for the last 8 years. In 2001, the Iranians collaborated extensively with the United States in Afghanistan and helped not only defeat the Taliban, but most importantly, according to the special representative of President Bush, the Iranians played a decisive role in making sure that a political solution to the Afghan crisis was found and that a new constitution was agreed upon. This happened, or the culmination of this was on December 10th, 2001 at the Bonn conference in Germany, in which a new Afghan constitution, the beginnings of that was established. But only 6 weeks later, the United States, under President George W. Bush, decided to put Iran in the axis of evil. And much of the goodwill and the collaboration that had been established was essentially evaporated. 2003, there is another proposal. Again, the same individuals played a key role in this, in which the Iranians suggested a grand negotiation with the United States, listing a whole set of various issues that the two sides should discuss, a 3-step roadmap on how they would be able to achieve this. And within the context of things that were achievable, according to this document, the Iranians would open up their nuclear program for full transparency. This is at a moment in which probably they didn't have more than 164 centrifuges. Today, they have 19,000. They offered to collaborate in Iraq and ensure that the government there would not be a sectarian one. They even, in one version of it, even discussed Iran accepting the Saudi peace plan for Israel and Palestine, the idea that the Arab world, the Muslim world, would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state. These were very far-fetched and far-reaching considerations. Unfortunately, the Bush administration decided not to respond to it at all, did not take it seriously, and frankly never really investigated it to be able to determine whether this proposal actually was fully serious and if it could lead somewhere. And in 2005, this very same team made an offer to the European negotiators, offering to cap the Iranian nuclear program at no more than 3,000 centrifuges. But that also didn't go anywhere. After that, you have 8 years of Ahmadinejad. I probably don't have to recap all the different things that happened there. But you saw the country go in a very different direction, and so did the West. And we saw years of confrontation and escalation from both sides, which, according to the Secretary of Defense of the United States, could have escalated into a military confrontation. With the return of the Rohani team and the individuals there who had a track record of pursuing a very different path, from the White House's perspective, suddenly there was someone on the Iranian side that they felt it was worthwhile investing in the sense that from the president's perspective, President of the United States, to pursue diplomacy with Iran carries a tremendous amount of domestic political cost. You can see that by just watching the Secretary of State, John Kerry, defending the interim deal to a very skeptical Congress yesterday on C-SPAN. And it wasn't worthwhile for the American side to take the risk of going down the path of truly serious negotiations if there wasn't confidence that the other side was going to do the same thing. And of course, from the Iranian side, they have the very same concern. Does the president have the political strength to be able to see through this process, not just negotiate with the Iranians, but also negotiate afterwards with the US Congress and everyone else in the US establishment that either is skeptical or flat out opposed to the idea of reaching a settlement on this issue? But Rohani's election, I would say, has been one of the most important factors that has enabled this to come about. You can just imagine where we would be today if there had been one of the other candidates that had come and won the elections in Iran. My bet is that you would not have seen almost any of the negotiations that thus far has taken place. On the American side, a very accidental factor led the president down this road in a way that I think he himself may not have expected. And what I'm referring to is what happened with Syria. The conversation and the effort, of course, from the president, the proposal that there would be a military campaign to punish the Assad regime for having used chemical weapons. What happened in Washington when this proposal came out, when the president gave that interview, that press conference at the Rose Garden, was truly astonishing. It took the White House by great surprise, and it certainly took Congress by great surprise. And what I'm referring to is this overwhelming, ferocious opposition by the American public to the idea of another military campaign. Because the issue went to Congress, people started calling their members of Congress and expressing their opposition to this. And we have members of Congress who reported that for every phone call they received in favor of a vote to bomb Syria, they received about 1,000 phone calls very, very intensely opposed to that very idea. In fact, I would say that in the context of making credible threats, which I'm sure you all have heard about a lot, I would say the most credible threat that was issued throughout this entire drama was the credible threat by the American public to members of Congress that we will vote you out of Congress if you vote in favor of this decision to go to war, the resolution to authorize force against Syria. What that did, I'm not saying that the president wasn't particularly happy about this, but what it did is that it made it very clear that there had been a miscalculation about the cost of pursuing military confrontation in terms of domestic political price and the cost of pursuing diplomacy. Suddenly, this pushed the president deep into diplomacy territory on Syria, but also on Iran. Because it was a realization that if this does not get resolved, at some point, the voices in favor of military action are going to be raised quite high. And actually, the president will pay a far less political price domestically if he pursues diplomacy. Diplomacy was simply a much safer proposition as a result of what happened with Syria. And I want to emphasize, this did take the Washington establishment pretty much by surprise. People did not expect this reaction by the population. And to a certain extent, I think the population itself did not expect that they would have the ability to be so effective. But it was very much because of a couple of accidental issues. The fact that the president decided to go and ask for authorization by Congress provided the population with the time to be able to mobilize very quickly and make sure that this signal was sent. A third factor, if you take a look at it from the American perspective, is that paradoxically, Iran, which was viewed as one of the most difficult issues in the Middle East just 9 months ago, now actually appears to be one of the lowest hanging fruit in the region, mindful of the fact that everything else in the region seems to be going in the wrong direction. Whether it is Syria, whether it is Israel-Palestine, whether it is what's happening in Egypt, or what might be happening in Saudi Arabia in the next couple of years, suddenly Iran had promise. And it made it, particularly for a president who must at this point be thinking about his legacy, realizing that when it comes to his legacy on the foreign policy front, this might be his last best chance to be able to succeed with a large issue and ensure that he has secured a legacy for himself going forward. It's frankly difficult to see how any other issue that has to be large enough to be able to have that type of a legacy component to it would emerge in the next year or so that the president would have a chance of resolving before he leaves office. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this must have been a factor one way or another for the president in pursuing this path. But the most important factor that has enabled the two sides to come to this interim agreement, and in my view, hopefully have them reach the final agreement, is something tremendously simple. And that is simply that they both compromised. We hear a lot, particularly in Washington, that the reason why the Iranians are at the table and the reason why we have this opening is because of the pressure of sanctions. I tend to hold a rather different view. It is true that sanctions have devastated the Iranian economy, everything from slashing its oil income with 50 or so percent, from shutting Iran out from the international financial system, making it next to impossible for them to engage in ordinary trade, as well as the impact that it has had on their currency, which at one point had lost about 60 to 70% of its value. But it's also true that during this very same period, the Iranians went from 164 to 3,000 to 19,000 centrifuges. That this very same period, we also saw the Iranians go from having a stockpile of about 800 or so kilos of low-enriched uranium when President Obama entered office, to now having more than 10,000. To a situation in which the Iranians now have enrichment at the 20% level, which is medium-high enrichment, which they did not have up until 2010, and that they also have a stockpile of 20% enriched uranium slightly below 200 kilos. What I think actually has happened, rather than being able to ascribe this breakthrough to the pressure of sanctions, is that for the last 8 years, both sides chased a pipe dream. Both sides were pursuing a completely unattainable objective. From the Western side, there was this insistence that there would be no centrifuges in Iran, that Iran would go down to zero enrichment, an objective that some in Congress still adhere to. This was a pipe dream from the outset. The Iranians were never going to accept that. That would be a complete violation of any notion that they're standing up for their independence, regardless of the amount of pressure that they would be faced with. But the Iranians also pursued a pipe dream of thinking that they could have an unlimited, unfettered nuclear program in spite of the violations that they are accused of and probably did commit prior to 2003. That was also a pipe dream. You were not going to see the international community succumb to such a fait accompli. And after 8 years of escalating, pursuing this pipe dream, gaining leverage, but having that leverage be canceled out by the fact that the other side also gained leverage, the other side also built facts on the ground, both sides have come to the realization that if they escalate it further from this point, they essentially have no escalatory options left that wouldn't risk an all-out military confrontation. And then they did exactly what you do in diplomacy when you actually get a deal, which is that you compromise, that you accept the other side's bottom line. And that's exactly what's happened. Now, obviously, politicians are not going to go out to the podium and hold a press conference and brag about having compromised. That's not going to happen in the American political context, and certainly not in the Iranian either. But reality is this: while they will credit their own firm policies, it is the compromise, the acceptance of the other side's bottom line that has enabled this opening. And what are those? From the Iranian side, from the American side or the Western side, an acceptance that there will be enrichment on Iranian soil at the end of this process. Obviously, it will be under strict inspections, and there will probably be a long period in which there will be also significant limitations to it. One limitation that the Iranians have already essentially agreed to is that it will be no higher than 3.5% enriched uranium. But nevertheless, the Iranian red line that they will have enrichment on their soil is part of this deal. From the Iranian side, they've also accepted the bottom line of the American position in particular, which is Iran will not have a breakout capability, an undetectable breakout capability on a path towards a military weapon. That will not exist at the end of this negotiation if it is pursued further and they reach the final deal and Iran signs and ratifies the additional protocol that would give the IAEA the most intrusive ability to inspect and verify what the Iranians are doing. This, in my view, could have been achieved 8 years ago if neither side was pursuing their pipe dreams. Now, fortunately, they're not doing that any longer. At least those who are in charge in both countries are now pursuing a much more realistic approach. And I hope that once the history writers write the final account of what actually happened, that they recognize this rather than attributing this to some sort of a success of pressure politics, because that would set a very bad precedent for future cases that might emerge, because this was largely a result of a set of accidents that we are now in the positive scenario that we are in today. This could very easily have gone in a very, very different direction and should not be a blueprint of handling situations of this kind going forward. Now, the challenges that remain going forward are, of course, that the biggest step from the American side is going to be taken after this interim deal. If the interim deal is fully completed and they enter the second stage, that's where the US would have to lift its nuclear-related sanctions in return for even bigger steps from the Iranian side. The reason why this is very tricky is because these sanctions go through the US Congress. And that means that it's the US Congress that will have to make decisions in order to lift them. The president can use his waivers, but I personally am not confident of a permanent solution if the sanctions are still there, but they're constantly being waived, because that means that the next president has to honor the agreement. And it's difficult to see the Iranians taking permanent steps in return for very temporary steps from the American side. And mindful of the dysfunctional state of the US government right now, or at a minimum, the dysfunctional relationship between the US Congress and the executive branch right now, this will be a tremendous challenge. Even under normal circumstances, it would be a very difficult challenge, but it will be a particularly difficult challenge to make sure that this succeeds in the second step. So however difficult the interim agreement was, I would say that the second phase of this is going to be far more challenging than the first step. And then, of course, from the Iranian side, I think there are elements in Iran on the more conservative and radical side who are just waiting and hoping that the Rohani Zarif team are unsuccessful, that their approach is proven unsuccessful, and that would enable them to regain the position they had before the elections. So far, I think we have to be honest and be somewhat impressed with the discipline of the Iranian government in speaking in one voice and making sure that there are no sabotage attempts and that the Rohani team has a full backing of the government for these negotiations. I think it's frankly unprecedented, the degree of discipline that we're seeing. But it won't last unless this process continues to have momentum and move forward and make progress. Setbacks can very easily spread and make sure that opponents of this approach on both sides will regain their momentum and sabotage it completely. And this brings me to the final point before we open up to questions, which is ultimately, this is so much more than just about enrichment, centrifuges, and breakout capabilities. If this is successful and reaches a final stage, then this will help determine who will define Iran for decades to come. Will it be those who pursue the approach and the mindset and the worldview of Ahmadinejad and some of the radicals and conservatives in Iran, and we know the approach that they have pursued for the last 8 years? Or will it be those who see the world through the prism of people like the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif or the President Rohani, who have pursued what they call win-win solutions, positive sum relationships, have shown far greater flexibility, far greater willingness to take a risk for peace rather than just constantly take a risk for confrontation? And this will have repercussions that go well beyond the nuclear issue. It will have repercussions when it comes to Iran's internal politics, because perhaps it will be the first time that the Iranian moderates will be able to show that moderation actually pays off, that moderation brings about better results for the country than the confrontational approach of other entities in Iran. Again, they were proven wrong during the Bush years when they pursued moderation and got nothing for it. If they again end up getting nothing for it, then unfortunately, that will probably be the end of the road for them. But I want to end on that point because I want to make it clear that at least when you follow the conversation in Washington, it tends to become very technical. The number of centrifuges and what level of degree of enrichment can you have and how often will the cameras of the IAEA be able to take pictures of what's happening in the facilities in Iran, etc. And we're losing the larger picture, that this could be something that could, for decades to come, shift the orientation of Iran towards something that is much, much easier for the international community to handle and something that could be much more constructive for the region as a whole. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the thought-provoking and informative presentation about the Iran nuclear interim agreement. We heard today that diplomacy has delivered the US and Iran from the brink of disastrous war and placed the two countries at the beginning of a brighter, more sustainable path forward. We learned also that the interim agreement is a historic agreement that could be a new beginning for the people and nations of the Middle East region and beyond. And also, we learned that diplomacy worked this time. And also, our speaker was telling about the three most important factors that enabled the agreement to be done. Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to pose a question to Dr. Tirta Parsi. What has surprised you most during the Geneva talks?
Thank you. I thought it was if we just take a look at what happened in Geneva, I thought it was very interesting to see how hard both sides really negotiated. The last round was supposed to take 2 days. It took 4 days. Last day, I think the negotiators were up about 23 hours until they got to the final agreement and they gave the press conference, etc. And they were negotiating. I was sitting with the media and we were mostly playing with Twitter, and that was very exhausting. But you can imagine how exhausting it must have been for them actually negotiating. But if anything in this entire situation that I would say that I've been perhaps surprised, let me say, impressed and surprised by, is the manner in which President Obama shifted and really went down so determined down the road of diplomacy, and for the first time since he came into office was willing to take on Congress and pay the political price of pursuing something that I know that he genuinely believes lies in the interests of the United States and the international community as a whole. In previous, as in my book, I have been somewhat critical of the administration in the sense that their attempts in the past tended to be well-intended, but they gave up very, very easily. At the first indication of domestic political opposition, the president tended to back off because he didn't feel that it was worthwhile to pay the price. It's night and day right now in the manner in which the president is really spending so much resources selling this deal, engaging with Congress, but also pushing back against Congress in ways that we simply have not seen. And incidentally, this is not necessarily Iran-specific. This is more specific to just the orientation and the DNA of this administration, which simply has not developed the habit of engaging with Congress in the manner that many other administrations did and be willing to truly pay the political price for some of the initiatives that they're pursuing.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time for the interactive part, and I would like to welcome any questions from the audience for Tirta Parsi. Please. There. Please introduce yourself. Sorry, we don't hear you.
Nancy Camel. I'm the UN representative for Vital Voices and the US National Commissioner for UNESCO. My question is, thank you very much, first of all, for your very cogent and understanding presentation. and it's an area that obviously we all have great interest and have been following very closely. My question is, I understand the obvious and aforementioned goal of removing the sanction, but what would be the main external, or some of the external points that you would like, that Iran would like to gain from the international community once this resolution has brought them back into the community of states? Thank you.
Thank you. If I understood the question, it would essentially be, beyond sanctions relief, what are the things that the Iranians are looking forward to? Well, I think these are connected to each other, because what it essentially is decontainment. It's the decontainment both politically and economically, meaning that there would be a process of rehabilitating Iran economically and politically in the region. Now, of course, Iran has relations with all of the regions, not necessarily good relations all the time, but what it has not had is a recognized role in the region that enables it to pursue its interests in manners that are not of the nature that we may have seen them pursue in the past. Iran has been excluded from most political avenues of influence. It's not part of any major security pacts. It's not part of any major international bodies for the region specifically. And it is essentially, to a certain extent, on the official level, been on the outside. I've always been of the view that moderating the policies coming out of Tehran is going to be much more successful if there is a joint process of bringing them into the fold in return for, obviously, shifts in their political positions. But as long as they're not included, the price for them to pursue policies that can be spoiler policies has not been particularly high. This is part of the reason why I believe that if this process is permitted to continue, it's successful, it brings changes that just go beyond the nuclear issue, you're going to have a natural tendency also to see the government in Tehran to moderate its position even on issues such as Israel. In fact, I would say already now, just with diplomacy starting, you have a very different predisposition of the Iranian government now vis-a-vis Israel than you had just a couple of months ago. It's quite a different thing to have the president of Iran in interview after interview raise questions about the authenticity of the Holocaust, to now having a president that tweets Happy Rosh Hashanah to the Jewish people worldwide. Doesn't mean that on the core positions of the Israeli state that the Iranians have changed their position. No, not at all. I think many of those lines are still there. But it is nevertheless quite important that this posture shifts. And I think what we've seen may just be the very beginning of this. Much more can happen, not on this issue alone, but on many issues, if this process is permitted to continue. And I think that would also have very positive repercussions for many of the Arab states, particularly in the GCC, that currently are very worried about what this means for them, what this means for the future constellation of the region as a whole.
Okay. There is a question. There is a question, please.
My name is Nizar Aboud. I am the correspondent of Al Mayadeen television station in Beirut. My question is, do you think that without what Ahmadinejad has achieved on the military front, especially with his support to Hezbollah in 2006 and the victory which was achieved against Israel at the time, you would have seen a reluctant America going to war in that region, also with the support they have provided in Syria and to other groups. The repeated failures at the time by Israel. Do you think that such hesitation by America would have happened during this time?
Okay. Thank you. So the question essentially is, had there not been for the developments in 2006, but also other in which proxy confrontation between Iran and Israel ended up not being particularly favorable towards Israel, if I understood you correctly, if that had an impact on in the disposition of the United States when it comes to viewing a military campaign against Iran. I would have two answers for that. The first answer is for the Obama administration. The Obama administration came in very clearly on a platform of ending wars, not starting new ones. So what happened in Lebanon may not have been particularly decisive for the approach of the Obama administration. I don't think they came in with the idea that if there was an opportunity to pursue a military option, they would jump on it. On the contrary, they were looking for opportunities to resolve things peacefully rather than the opposite. But when it comes to the Bush administration, I think, yes, absolutely, it did have an impact. I remember speaking to Ephraim Sneh, who was at the time the Deputy Defense Minister of Israel, in the middle of the engagement between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. And he told me that war with Iran is inevitable, and what you're seeing in Lebanon is nothing but a prelude to that war. And the calculation essentially was that in order to pave the way for a larger military confrontation with Iran, you first needed to make sure that allies of Iran that constitute Iran's deterrence and retaliatory capabilities are first eliminated before you actually can take on Iran itself. Now, was that the calculation on the American side? Well, it certainly seemed to be the calculation on the Israeli side based on what Ephraim Sneh, and he was a deputy defense minister, he probably would know something about it, said. The fact that that ending up so badly, I think certainly made people in the Pentagon realize that the costs and repercussions of a military confrontation with Iran was going to be much, much higher than they first may have thought. But having said that, I also want to say that the inclination to pursue military confrontation with Iran from the Pentagon side has not been particularly high since 2004, 2 years before what happened in Lebanon, based on what happened in Iraq. In fact, in the last couple of years, some of the strongest elements of opposition to a military confrontation within the US government has been the Pentagon itself.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Dr. Parsi. I have a question. I don't know if it makes any sense, but what change of foreign policy do you think can be implemented to turn around the damage, if there is any, that can serve as leverage to good relations? Because there is Iran and America. So, and it's affecting the whole world. What change of foreign policy do you think can be done to have a whole, harmony in the foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you. So the question essentially is, what shifts in foreign policy can make sure that the US-Iran relations goes in a different direction, mindful of the fact that it is affecting everything else in the region? And I want to emphasize that specific point. As long as the relationship between the United States and Iran has been as dysfunctional as it has been in the last 34 years, and mindful of the influence of both the United States and Iran, you had a situation in which almost every other conflict in the region more or less was, if not hijacked, at least deeply influenced, and became an arena for the larger US-Iranian rivalry. And I think we can see that, and this is not an uncommon thing. We see that in Syria right now, not necessarily between the United States and Iran, but between Iran and Saudi Arabia more so. And it's also had a very negative effect because there's also been areas in which the two sides actually had very close and common interest. But because of the larger difficulty between them, areas of common interest and commonality could not be explored in the manner that you would think it could be, mindful of the overarching enmity between them that was overshadowing everything else. And this goes back to, again, what I said earlier on. If at a minimum you can have this solution to the nuclear issue, establish a more normal type of a conversation between the United States and Iran, I would suspect that there would still be a rivalry, perhaps a conflict between them, but it would be in a very different framework. it would be codified in a very, very different way. It would be limited, it would be contained, and it would permit areas of collaboration to be explored. Certainly Afghanistan remains one of the areas in which both could gain a lot by collaborating much more than they currently are. Down the road, I think this could have a very deep impact on the region. You would not end up in a situation that every time there is a conflict somewhere in the region, the US and Iran almost automatically would end up on the opposite sides of each other and would exacerbate the problem rather helping towards resolving it. Because the US-Iran conflict actually has made other conflicts that were not necessarily easy to solve, but not impossible to solve, become more difficult to solve. And this is critical. I think this is absolutely critical. And those are one of the things that I think it's important to understand this entire negotiation, this entire effort from a larger perspective and not solely view it from the prism of the nuclear issue.
Please, there is one question.
Yes, thank you. Pinkas Javits from the Sustainable Development Media and the World Association of Former UN Interns and Fellows. My question is, what was the impact of the present decreased reliance on Middle East oil on these changes?
Very good. So the question is, what has the role of the decreased reliance on Middle East oil been in order to be able to get these openings? I can only speculate because this is not my core area of expertise, but it certainly seems to have strengthened a belief in Washington that, mindful of the fact that the US has discovered a lot of oil on its own soil and you have shale oil and other things, the dependence on the Middle East is a bit less than it was before. You combine that with what is happening in the Arab world since 2011 with the uprisings, and you get a very clear picture that the appetite in Washington to continue its relationship with the states in the Arab world according to the formula that existed prior to that, which is that the United States was very close to several Arab states that were, to put it diplomatically, far less than democratic. It turned a blind eye to many of the abuses that were taking place there. In return, that those states pursued foreign policies that were clearly in line with that of the United States. That formula is no longer a sustainable formula. And the United States, the decreased reliance on oil, the fact that the old formula was not going to be able to sustain itself anyways, as well as the belief that there needs to be a pivot to the east, although it's not clear exactly what happened with that. All of that, I think, has created fissures between the United States and some of its key allies in the region. I would say that between the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, there has been a divergence of views on three core issues. One is exactly this, the Arab Spring and the future order of the region. The other one has been the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and the third one has been Iran. On these core issues, you're seeing that the perspectives tend to grow. The difference in the perspectives have tended to grow quite dramatically over the course of the last couple of years. There is, from some elements in Israel, a desire, certainly in Saudi Arabia, that the old order, the old formula, is still revivable. In fact, it is sustainable. And in the words of one Israeli commentator, he said, "We believe that the old order is sustainable, and it is the job of the United States to sustain it." That is not the perspective, I can tell you, in Washington any longer. Even if it was an option, it did not appear to be an option that didn't bear too high of a cost. With those fissures, you've also had a situation in which the decision to pursue an opening with Iran, which clearly the administration knew was going to create a lot of anxiety in Israel and in Saudi Arabia, that decision may, and I'm speculating now, have become a bit easier because the reliance on the Middle East has become a bit less, because the divergence of perspectives tended to be there anyways. But I want to emphasize, I'm speculating on the last point there.
Okay. Mona, please.
I would like to ask you about the relation between the Arab states and Iran, and why you don't start, I mean, I don't think it's only the relation between America and Iran. You have to start to solve your problem and the tension that you have between you and the Arab states and the CGC, since they are your neighbors. Don't you think this is also a priority for you? And I think there is a priority also to change the way the people in Iran thinks, because you still have people, it's not only about Rohani or Ahmadinejadi, it's about the people who are following them and how they think as well.
Thank you so much. Let me just clarify one thing. I'm not speaking for the Iranian government. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I represent an organization of Iranian Americans. When it comes to resolving the regional issues, I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. I think those are very, very high priorities. But at the same time, an overarching conflict that has made everything else more problematic has been the nuclear issue. And it was a decision by the US side first, in which they would not talk to the Iranians about any other issue until the nuclear issue first had been addressed and resolved. And that was a position, incidentally, that the Iranians appeared to not agree with up until the Rohani government came to the same conclusion, and they decided to put all other issues on the side until they first resolved the nuclear issue. I understand the perspective of some of the states in the region who believe that, mindful of the fact that this deeply affects them, that they should be involved in this, that they should have been at the table. Why is Germany at the table on this issue? Nothing against Germany, but why are they at the table, whereas states that are just neighboring Iran are not? And I think that's an understandable perspective. And at the same time, one also has to ask, what have the efforts been from the Arab side then to engage in broader dialogue with the Iranians on these specific issues? Oftentimes, many of them, in my view, have kind of hidden behind the United States, thinking perhaps that the United States would not move towards a resolution of this. And now when it is, there's a lot of anxiety as to why is this happening without the involvement of the Arab states. I think ultimately on this issue, there probably wasn't another way. But when it comes to the issues that will follow, when it comes to Syria, when it comes to some of these other issues, it's going to be critical. Everyone from the region have to be at the table. No one can be excluded, because if you exclude elements, you provide them with incentives to play the role of a spoiler, and even if you manage to get an agreement, the agreement is not going to be particularly durable. And there I think it's absolutely critical, in particular, to resolve the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because that is then the next issue that is unfortunately taking all other issues hostage and preventing the type of constructive efforts that are needed. But that's going to require efforts from all sides, certainly the Iranians, but also from the Saudi side. One more? Okay.
Please, there again.
I was going to ask about spoilers. And here, given that Saudi Arabia and Israel emerged to be the losers out of an agreement or rapprochement between the United States and Iran, do you expect them to take any drastic measure in order to spoil such an agreement, especially, or given the strong power of the Israeli lobby in the United States and its influence on the Congress?
First of all, I would say I don't share the view that Israel and Saudi Arabia are losers of this. I think from a very limited perspective, some political personalities may view it as such. But I actually don't think. I think at the end of the day, mindful of the fact that from the Israeli side, there has been this claim that the Iranian nuclear bomb is an existential threat. Well, mindful of the fact that there's not going to be a nuclear bomb in Iran should be welcomed and should be seen as something that actually alleviates this problem. Also from the Saudi side, I understand. I think actually Iran is just tip of the iceberg. There's a whole trend of changes in the region that I think that the Saudis are very concerned about. But I don't see them in the long run being losers of this at the end of the day, because then it essentially means that perpetual conflict with Iran would lie in the long-term interest of Saudi Arabia and Israel. I could not agree with that. And I'm not saying that you say that. I know it was just the premise of your question. When it comes to spoilers, certainly Congress has moved forward and positioned itself to be the most likely spoiler. Very easy for them to spoil this. At the end of the day, the interim agreement said very clearly there cannot be any new sanctions imposed on Iran on the nuclear issue. If there is, that's a direct violation of the agreement. And it's not particularly difficult for Congress to pass sanctions on Iran. They're actually very, very good at it. They can do it in their sleep. So the role that Congress can play in this, and of course there's groups that influence Congress on these issues, makes it probably the primary element that I think people in the White House are worried about. Doesn't mean that there aren't others, and it doesn't mean that there aren't elements in Iran who could not do the same. But just to put this in perspective, you had in Iran this past week a letter signed by 20 lawmakers out of 290 in their parliament, opposing the deal and even wanting to bring in Zarif for questioning or unseating him, the foreign minister who negotiated this. That's 20 out of 290. Compare that to what you saw yesterday in the hearing when Kerry was faced with these very, very skeptical questions and these implicit accusations of surrender.
Given that Khomeini himself issued an edict banning such the production of nuclear weapons.
I think the Iranians have pursued pretty much the same policy that was pursued during the time of the Shah, which was they were seeking to have a nuclear program that came as close as possible towards having a military dimension or giving the option to build a bomb without building the bomb, because building the bomb carries with it a tremendous amount of costs, strategic difficulties, and other things. But wanting to have the option in that neighborhood was something that the Shah actively pursued. Incidentally, at the time in the 1970s when Iran started its nuclear program, it did so with the very, very active encouragement of the United States under the leadership of Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were then in the Ford administration, who were pushing the Iranians, convincing Iran that it could not be a modern state unless it did have a nuclear program. The United States even provided Iran with 93% enriched uranium, which today it would have been a complete scandal if the Iranians possessed anything near that. So I see a lot of continuity there. I think from the international community's perspective, the effort has to be on making sure that the inspections and verification is so strong that there essentially is no ability for any future government in Iran to move in the direction of weaponization without getting caught at the very earliest stage of that process and then having that process reversed. That's the best possible outcome that can be achieved.
Okay, thank you. I think we start to close this meeting, and I thank the audience for active participation and would like to especially thank our speaker, Tirta Parsi, for the excellent and comprehensive presentation. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to be here today. Before concluding, I would like to remind everyone of our next event, which will be on Monday, January 20th at 1:15. Our next speaker will be Ms. Amina Mohammed, Special Advisor of the Secretary General on Post-2015 Development Planning. And on behalf of Women's International Forum, I would like to give a little present to our excellent speaker, Dr. Tirta Parsi, and wish him good luck and success. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all again on January 20th. And on behalf of WIF, I want to wish you all peace, hope, and happiness during this holiday season and success for the new year. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.